When I say the word mentor, what does that mean to you? Is that someone who supervises you in a work setting? Someone who you go to for career advice or training? Is that someone who supports you informally, maybe emotionally? Is it someone who serves as representation, who gives you a kind of advice that you can't get anywhere else? If you know anything about me, you know that I think about mentoring a lot. As a graduate student, I've mentored plenty of undergraduate students through my lab, as research assistants, through on-campus organizations like OSTEM or grad student associations, and informally through connections I've made to younger queer and trans people over the years. And there's a lot to mentoring, more than can ever be encompassed in a single podcast episode by a single woman. Mentoring means a lot of different things, from collaborating on a research project to giving career advice to just listening and being a shoulder to cry on. And as I'm finishing up graduate school and transitioning into the next phase of my career, I wonder, what role will mentoring play, specifically when it comes to mentoring younger queer and trans people in STEM? If all goes well, within the next few months, I'll be a faculty member, where my job will be to teach chemical engineering principles and head multiple diversity, equity, and social justice initiatives at my university. A big part of that, I think, will be that mentorship piece. And I want to be that professor that you could come to if you're having a bit of gender trouble. But having interacted with trans people from all walks of life, I know that no two transitions are the same. I also know that many university faculty and staff, or people in leadership positions in general, college or not, may support trans people in principle, but they aren't 100% familiar with the systemic issues that many trans people face. So for this month's episode, I set out to answer the question, what does it take to mentor a trans person? I'm particularly looking through a STEM lens, since trans representation in STEM is not great, but I wanted to make this as evergreen as I could. What can we learn from the ways that trans people find community in one another? What kind of support systems are out there for trans youth these days, and how can we supplement them? How do we incorporate trans feminism into our work as engineers or techies or whatever field that you're in? I'm also busy finishing up my PhD and wanted a semi-easy, not very research-intensive episode, so sorry not sorry. To that end, I talked to two incredible trans mentors of mine, and I asked them how they found community, the ways they've given back, and how they've made spaces more trans-inclusive where they are. These two were so open and honest and vulnerable, and I super appreciate them for that. To support trans people, you need to know what we go through. Hopefully, this can serve as a guide for cisgender people, or even other trans people, on how to cultivate a safe environment for trans youth, or trans colleagues in general. It'll be part Trans 101, part deep dive into trans history, part action plan. So let's jump into it. My name is Anna Marie. Welcome to the Rule 63 podcast.
Content notices for this episode include transphobia, brief mentions of suicide and self-harm, and racial injustice.
To begin, if you really want to understand the needs of trans people today, you actually have to look back and do a little bit of history. That's why I sought out Cassandra Martineau, a trans elder in my community and amazing trans advocate and activist. Cass is a trans feminist, socialist, anarchist warrior queen, as she describes on her Facebook page. She is an actively anti-racist advocate, educator, and speaker on trans and LGBTQ issues and marginalized humans in general. She's also a leader in the local and state Green Party, NAACP, and so much more.
I do a lot of informal mentoring. And, sometimes I talk to somebody once or twice and they got a little information, specific or general, or that little boost. Sometimes I develop a relationship with somebody, however it works is all great. I just want to be the person I didn't have when I was growing up. It's my goal to be a trans mom to as many kids as I can.
Cassandra's story is so interesting, can make up a whole novel, and harkens back to when she was growing up in Cheshire, Connecticut in the 1970s.
Well, no, I mean, I really harken back to around 8 or 9. I didn't have the language for it specifically, but, knew very much at that age that I wanted to / was supposed to be a girl. I was brought up strict Catholic and, I didn't know anything else. So I was very much a believer. And I can remember for, whatever forever feels like for an 8-year-old, years, whatever, praying to God as I went to bed every night that I would wake up as a girl. And when that didn't happen, praying that these feelings would be taken away from me. That didn't happen either. So I kind of, decided to take things into my own hands, as it were.
Any trans person will tell you that the first step of your transition is realizing that you need to do it. And the first step of that is realizing that you can, and having the language to describe your experiences. Nowadays, trans experiences in the media are hard to ignore, but back in the day, you probably learned about the trans experience from some interesting places.
I did find somebody left me, like a Playboy or some kind of porno mag, when I was 10, 12, whatever it was. And I wasn't so much really interested in the nudes, but there was an actual story in the very back about a trans woman who transitioned at Yale University. And it was very matter of fact and an honest thing. And that I got the word transsexual at that point. This is 10, 12 or whatever. In the 70s, there's no internet, or 80s, whatever it was, early 80s, and bells and whistles just clicked in word in my skull all around.
To get support for her transition before the days of the internet, Cassandra needed to find other trans people. And as you can imagine, this was difficult and kind of scary. After finding that magazine cutout, she got connected to a pastor who was able to connect her with a group of like-minded individuals up in Massachusetts.
It was very much secretive, and, because of safety reasons, it was, if you're able to edit and cue the spy music, this is the point you add that in. I literally drove up to the 7-Eleven in the middle of nowhere, this big black van with no windows, the sliding doors and no windows on it, pulls up next to me after a little while, door slides open. There's, maybe inside half a dozen trans women, drag queens. We kind of all mixed together in this place. And at that time, and they're like, get in. So, I got in, and I'm like, the young trans person who's, never naive and never been, I'm kind of looking around at all the faces, and they start peppering me with questions. When did you first know? How do you, what do you, and I'm like, answering honestly, straight, little, and then, after a few minutes, like, okay, follow us, And I got out of the van and back in my own car, and they drove down this, this is after dark. It was around twilight. I met them at this 7-Eleven and drove down this dark road with no houses on either side, lined with trees. Couldn't see the sky, couldn't see anything around this long, dark, if this isn't the setup for every horror movie I've seen. And at the end was this huge, like, manse, it was this big, huge house, surrounded by woods in the middle of nowhere. And, down in the basement, they had makeup stations. A lot of girls would go there. They weren't safe at home, and they'd go there and make up and then go hit out the clubs and stuff in Boston.
What Cass is describing here is Wayland House, which was a privately owned home in Wayland, Massachusetts.
But, that was Wayland House. And, I remember sitting down and having a conversation. I got my first big sister. We used family language back then. We talked about sisters and mothers and, such, because so many of us lost so much of that.
If you're not familiar with the long and rich history of transition houses, you are missing out. We don't have too much time to get into it in this episode, but basically these were, and in some cases still are, informally operated safe havens for queer and trans people. At these homes, much like the families formed in the drag ball scene in cities around the country, you could find a chosen family in other queer and trans people, and you could transition in a hyper-controlled environment before trying to go back to a normal life.
And there were a number of young people and some older people who, and again, back then, you expected to lose and probably disconnect with your entire family. If you were to come out and live that, it very frequently meant you were saying goodbye to everybody to claim this life. And, it's not only, those connections of the heart and your emotional connections, but you lose a lot of, we gain a lot in our work and our, connections, and through family, and we lose all that too. Lost all that. I think that's a lot less so, but it still does happen very often in this community. A lot of us lose our careers. People who were experts in their field just, were persona non gratis. I knew a number of older trans people who did, lived 50-50 lives, and they'd be themselves at home and kept their old identity at work because they had good high paying jobs and didn't want to lose it. And I just remember, sitting down with, and I do forget the lady's name, who ran the house, and, she was a respected, wise elder, and she just calmly asked me a couple of questions. And it's like, if you could redo high school, would you? And I'm like, as a boy, with this look at it. And she's very like, other people wouldn't answer that way, right? Just kind of gently, kind of easing out if I had any doubts about who I was. She was just kind of gently ridding me of any of that. And after a little bit of that, she's got like into this package of peppermints, old Pepperidge Farms cookies, and pulls out one and hands it to me. Congratulations, you're one of us.
Thankfully, support for trans people has improved since the days of hopping into unmarked vans and intense lines of questioning, but it's been a bit of a slow burn.
When I was working at Eastern, and a lot of times in the work I do, my little tagline under my email and all the rest of that is community equals strength, because I believe that's one of the strongest things we have. It's how we survived when things were much less safe for us right now. I remember being part of queer community in general through AIDS and Reagan and Bush. And, they were literally national figures making jokes about how AIDS was God's way of clearing out the and instead of doing anything, and our community are the ones who came together. We promoted safe sex and, information and all that. They always talk about sex ed. Oh, get it from the professionals, not from your friends. Well, they weren't telling anything. The professionals weren't talking about us. We had to get it through our friends, and we stepped up as a community and came together. And, I'd be in so many gay lesbian houses, and they'd have the posters for safe sex and other issue stuff, as well as their pride stuff.
But here in Connecticut, Cass was one of the people who fought for trans equity in employment and healthcare. Thanks to the Connecticut Trans Advocacy Coalition, or CTAC, Connecticut has long been a pioneer of trans rights, being one of the first states to allow people to change their gender marker without requiring surgery, expanding hate crime and anti-bullying laws to include protections for trans people, and lots of other big wins. So, in part, I have Cass to thank for making my legal document changes go so smoothly. Thanks, Cass.
So, yeah, since I've transitioned fairly early on in my transition, I decided to be fairly out. And, I'm very active in town politics, for instance, and, a leader in the Green Party. I'm active in a lot of local groups such as NAACP. I've done immigration work, environmentalist work. And, whenever I'm in groups of people for any sustained period of time, I generally tend to come out at some point. I don't, go around that first circle. Hi, Cass. I'm Cass. I'm trans. I like to get people, and because I have quote unquote passing privilege, whole nother issue. I do like people to know me as a human being before they know me as a trans person, because, you spend 15 minutes talking with someone, it becomes a lot harder not to humanize them and not to see them as a human. And I think just that process in and of itself is a really good thing. And it just strips away a lot of the stereotypes. All these trans people are such and such and such, but look at Anne Marie. She's pretty and she's nice and she's smart and, blah, 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 whatever,
I am really grateful for Cass's activism and her willingness to share her story. She's been a mentor to me and so many others, and the ability to talk to a trans elder is an immense privilege. By the way, Wayland House is still in operation today, now called Waltham House. Wayland, Massachusetts is part of Waltham, Massachusetts. It's a group home for LGBT youth ages 14 to 18, one of only 3 of its kind in the United States.
You can literally go online now, look up Wayland House, type in trans, and they're very open. They have an open presence on the internet. They're very open and accessible. It's still a transition house, and a great resource. And I think it's just a beautiful, it might have been a beautiful, show of how things have changed in a lot of ways.
Cass had a lot more to say about what transitioning was like in her later years, but first I'd like to bring in another perspective, since 2 transitions rarely look the same. They can vary wildly depending on geography and what sorts of resources and support systems you have access to. Also, as someone who works in the college environment, specifically in STEM, I'm interested in learning about the ways that campus communities can come together to support queer and trans youth. My other guest has done all of that, and we'll hear about their story after a quick ad break.
Rule 63 is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. You can help us make more episodes like this one at patreon.com/rule63. That's RULE63. You can find our website linked in our description, where you can find show notes for this episode, as well as the link to our Patreon and all our other socials.
So, the other incredible human I spoke to for this episode was Dr. Julie Johnston. She's an environmental microbiologist currently working at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and is one of the co-founders of Queer Science, a program for queer and trans teens interested in STEM, led by queer and trans researchers at the University of Minnesota. They're also a close friend of mine. The first thing I wanted to ask Julie was what sort of support system she had early on in her transition and who she was able to turn to in her times of need.
Early in my transition, my biggest support networks were some of my closest friends as well as my sister who were around me. I was at Clemson University as an undergrad, and I was in a program called the Peer Dialogue Facilitators, where we helped lead a lot of freshmen through really difficult dialogues, just so they knew a lot of the resources and just like how to be a little bit more socially aware at the university. And so I was already surrounded by a group of people who were generally pretty woke and feminist at the time. And 2 or 3 of them were exceptionally really good friends of mine who I could definitely latch onto and talk a lot more queer things with. My sister has also just been kind of my best friend throughout most of my life. And when I came out, she was definitely the first person who really started supporting me and letting me have safe spaces to try and express myself and play with my gender a little bit more safely.
So Julia was luckily able to turn to her family, but her transition story is also tied to her time in academia, starting at Clemson University in South Carolina, which is pertinent to my quest to make academic spaces more trans-inclusive. One thing I took note of were those first-year university dialogues that she mentioned.
Yes, it was at the school at large. So every single freshman had to attend one of our dialogues as just one of the introductory requirements. And so I was co-leading 2 different ones. One was on racism and addressing that on campus. And the other one was on mental health, which is the one that I kind of more or less led. And we were able to craft our dialogues based on whatever we wanted and how we wanted to do those. But we had to go through a full semester's worth of training just to be able to facilitate those spaces and go through difficult conversations. So it was a paid position at the time. And it just hooked me up in the right networks of some really amazing, diverse folks at my university.
Not only were these conversations critical for maintaining a safe atmosphere at Clemson, It was these university dialogues that actually had a major hand in making her realize that she needed to pursue a transition and empowered her to come out to the world.
I started the position before I came out to other people, and because we were reading so much literature that really challenges your identities, it kind of opened the floodgates for a lot of what I was already feeling and made it become something that I needed to, like, it really gave an impetus to, like, I need to come out and transition at this point in time.
So it was that exposure to a lot of different ideas and feminist spaces that really helped you realize that your own gender identity.
Yes.
That's really interesting. So throughout the rest of your undergrad, when did you become fully out to the world? Was it during undergrad or later?
It was during undergrad. We had gone away for the winter break, and that's when I kind of got to go home, hang out with my sister and my family, and start going out in public, at least in Florida, in some safer spaces. And it felt good enough that I sent out my emails and things like that on Facebook, notifying a bunch of people like, hey, this is who I am. And when I got back to campus, shortly after winter break, early January, there was a conference that I got to go to, which was Creating Change, which is a national organization for queer individuals to come together, all the queer organizers. I got to come out during there and present and be myself. And I was originally planning on going back to South Carolina at my university and still dressed as a boy, but that conference really broke it down where there's no going back. And I didn't go back from there. So after that conference, I had enough other people that I had seen and met, because I had never really met too many trans people, not until very shortly before I came out, that they had given me the confidence to be myself on campus.
So there's a lot of great stuff to take note of here. Supportive family members and colleagues, access to conferences and dialogues that expose us to new ideas, getting support from other trans people in the spaces that you occupy. But the first thing I wanted to unpack deeply is the notion of having a safe space early on in your transition to experiment with presentation. One of the big things I like to drive home about the trans experience to newcomers is that transitioning can be a messy and vulnerable process. It's not like you live years as a man, then show up to work one day with perfect makeup, an excellent sense of style and fashion, and a voice 2 octaves higher than before. Transitioning takes time, and this is something we need to respect and honor, especially for a newly out trans person. This was actually the very first thing that Cass brought up in my conversation with her, a philosophy that she likes to call respect the goo.
I would just suggest to give it that time. My phrase is respect the goo. We always talked for a long time about the butterfly metaphor. I mean, that one goes back to when I was young. And, we feel we're ugly caterpillars and we grow and we come out these beautiful butterflies. Everyone forgets that for, a while, a couple of months, that caterpillar goes into the cicatrix, its cocoon, whatever it goes into, and literally melts into an ugly mush of goo. I mean, it's a total hot fucking mess. And if you open up that cocoon, it's dead, And all I'm saying is to my beautiful young trans folks and other folks, respect the goo. It takes time. You're going to feel ugly and horrible and a hot mess at times, and that's okay. You're not, but respect the challenging feelings that come and respect that process and stay with it and have faith in it and have faith in yourself, because that butterfly time will come.
Plenty of trans people that I've talked to, whether they transitioned in their 20s or their 60s, have described transitioning to be like a second puberty. And when you look back at your puberty, well, do you think about those times fondly? Probably not. It's also worth noting that, for all teenagers, those early formative years were important to adapting to your social roles. If you're a cisgender woman, for instance, you probably had years of preteendom to practice the intricacies of female speech and presentation. You and your friends developed a sense of solidarity with one another. You copied each other's handwriting, traded outfits, developed a unique sense of style, and hopefully learned how to protect one another in a misogynistic world. Someone relatively new to womanhood didn't get those things, and depending on how accepting their peers are, they still may not be getting them. This is where that early transition affirming support network comes in.
Because for a lot of the other personal things, I had friends who were really supportive with me in South Carolina that like when I wanted to go and find clothing, we would drive down to Atlanta together. And even though early on I was like still dressing like as a boy, we would just go and shop for our friend Julie, who just happened to be my height. So we would always hold up the clothes and be like, do you think our friend Julie would like this? And like,
this all may sound frivolous at first, but because we live in a society, a lot of trans people feel a pressure not only to conform to traditional standards of beauty, but to get there as quickly as possible. This gets especially bad when they feel like they have to be exceptional by virtue of being the only trans person in their space. Because of all the negative stereotypes around trans people that exist in the world, we're under intense scrutiny at all times. So we often feel like we have to be a good representation of the community.
You know, and that's part of the challenge too, is when you're out, that pressure of the model minority. Sometimes even people who accept you or tolerate you or whatever level, you know, see you through a lens of where your mistakes tend to get magnified and your triumphs and achievements tend to get minimized. And I know this is very common across all marginalized people. Warning to people who grew up as white males who are transitioning to female, it's going to be a hell of a ride. You will have the wildest roller coaster ride through privilege that you never even expected.
Not conforming to traditional standards of beauty doesn't just feel awkward, it can have material consequences depending on where you work. Being under scrutiny, especially in a work environment that's actively hostile to trans people and looking for a way to get rid of them, just increases the risk of trans and gender nonconforming people getting harassed or fired. The notion of quote-unquote not dressing professionally has long been an excuse to excommunicate marginalized people, from the banning of certain religious garments to the illegalization of Black women's natural hair. All of this, of course, goes ditto for trans guys who have an even harder time finding acceptance among cis boys, because you know how they can be, and non-binary folks who have the fun task of inventing their own transition narrative while feeling alienated from both binary genders and finding a mode of dress that is both affirming and quote-unquote professional. Basically, all people who are not mask-presenting cis men are under this intense scrutiny, and trans people who are still in the early stages of transition have the additional hurdle of trying to conform quickly. So when you're working with a trans teen or trans person of any age, respect the goo. Give them space to express themselves as well as the time to figure out exactly what steps are right for them. And better yet, embrace gender nonconformity in your workplace. Have a conversation with your colleagues about what quote-unquote professional standards even mean. Doing so will liberate all people, cis or trans, from binary patriarchal beauty standards. And don't we all want that? Another thing that we have to take note of is that the trans experience is very diverse. In fact, we may have to come back to this topic again and again in future episodes. Even putting aside differences in race, economic class, and other societal factors, two trans people from the same town, same neighborhood, and same household may be on completely different timelines.
At the time, I really needed a couple other trans people who were out in my community who knew what rural resources looked like and where to find them, because the only two people who were older than me at the time, one of them had come out ages ago, and she has a lot of those like old horror stories, but also doesn't really have a realistic picture of where the world is at today, and has kind of just been surviving for so long. She was good for some like of that old wisdoms, but at the same time, it didn't always match or parallel my story. And then there was also a PhD student who was out, but she was also probably only like a year ahead of me as far as like medications and transition stuff. And she didn't have anything like blood issues or like other problems that were like coming up at the time. So again, there was nobody to like check, hey, if you're having this issue, this is the person to go to and talk to. Those resources just didn't exist.
A gender transition can have legal, medical, personal, and social components, and every trans person pursues different aspects of these to different degrees. There is no wrong or right way to be trans. One can go, heavy air quotes, all the way with hormones, presentation, affirming surgeries, legal name changes, the whole shebang, or any combination of these. For instance, many trans and non-binary people pursue some sort of gender-affirming surgery, but many don't. Many change their name to sound more gender-neutral or to be more masc or femme, but many don't. All of these are options, and not feeling like you have to transition a certain way is critical.
I even back in the day, the message, is like, hello, you're one of us. We're here for you. Now figure it out for yourself. You're on your own. It's, anytime somebody breaks it, oh, you have to get this surgery, you have to get this procedure, cut them off. Just cut them straight off. It was never about that. Some of us do like having these things done, and that's great. And it's good to know those options and to be able to honestly and openly discuss those options. So people, have informed consent for the decisions they make. But there can never be a hierarchy, because that was never the goal. The goal was, that mythic hero's journey to become yourself.
This is why having a diversity of experiences is so critical. It exposes you to a variety of options, and different people can point you towards different community resources depending on your unique needs. So having one trans person around to mentor all the trans people in your school probably isn't going to cut it. Much like raising a child, it takes a village. This brings us to the next big thing to understand about the trans experience. A lot of people understand trans oppression as a purely personal phenomenon. Misgendering, general dehumanizing, not believing being trans is real, etc. And while that's definitely the case and that is harmful, there's another dimension to how trans people are treated in larger institutions, such as in healthcare. My co-host Danny and I did a whole episode on this back in the day, episode 15 if you want to check it out. But the gist is, when doctors aren't informed on how to treat trans patients, and when trans patients aren't given the support that they need, they face this sort of systemic medical gatekeeping that can be really harmful, especially if they're younger or for whatever reason can't advocate for themselves to get that institutional access. In Connecticut, for instance, there are literally dozens of endocrinology offices, but only 2 of them in the whole state offer hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. And before you can even access those, you need a mental health professional to write you a letter of recommendation, which can take months of time and lots of money in copays, just for a piece of paper that verifies that you're trans.
So it was a little frustrating trying to figure out some of the medical logistics, like beyond just the gatekeeping of needing to have letters of recommendation. And this is like earlier in the 2010s. So there was still a lot of my therapist had written a small letter that explained just like Julie is trans and things like that. In case anything ever came up, I had a medical notice on me at all times, and that was in my wallet. I'm so glad that we're not there anymore, or at least in most places we are not. Even finding a therapist who was comfortable writing letters of recommendations for me, I had to go through our university's youth therapy clinic and specifically try to find the one person who was really comfortable as well as versed in trans issues. I didn't have to explain everything to them.
This makes trans healthcare really hard to access, especially if you can't afford trips to the doctor or don't have means of transportation. This is by design. And as a result, a lot of trans people get their medication from informed consent clinics or even the black market, which are valid ways of getting the life-saving medication that you need, but it presents risks because you're not getting regular blood work done or having your health evaluated by a medical professional. And even if you do find an endocrinologist who does provide HRT, that still may not be enough, depending on the expertise of those you have access to.
But for endocrinology, there was only one person in upstate South Carolina who was known for handing out estrogen as well as testosterone blocking, spironolactone. And she was only comfortable giving this one very specific regimen of them. So when my testosterone levels were still surprisingly high, even though I was on her usual dose of spironolactone, I asked her, can we up the dose? There's an entire community of trans people who have shown that this is very much a safe dose for me to increase to. This is not outside of the realm of normal. And she absolutely wasn't comfortable doing this. She really resisted the idea that this is what she knows, this is all she's going to do, and that's what she can help for the community.
Julie needed help beyond what the one endocrinologist in her area could provide, which meant that she needed to drive to another state to get that help.
So to find a doctor who was willing to go a little bit further and try different doses or maybe try a different medication and just had a little bit more experience, I had to go down to Atlanta, which was a 2-hour drive, to find a doctor who's much more familiar with trans medications. And that person was fairly awesome, where I had just mentioned so much like, hey, I was thinking about trying to start progesterone as well. And they were like, here's a script, let's go. Like, you're totally at that point where you should be trying to do this. And like, they already knew the playbook and how my body should be reacting to these medications in a reasonable way.
I personally went through 4 different therapists before finding one who had enough of a grasp on the transition process to feel comfortable writing my letters to acquire hormone therapy. Long story short, trans people go through a lot just to get their basic healthcare needs met because the current state of trans healthcare isn't where it should be. This is all changing, and in fact, my university, UConn, provides HRT and a number of other services, like our very own speech clinic, which has a voice modification group. But it's not coming quickly enough, and understanding these things and being able to direct other trans people to the resources that they need is going to make you a better mentor to trans people. Like, sorry, prof, I couldn't turn in my homework this week because I had to drive across the state to see a doctor so they can sign off on my life-saving medication. Hope you can forgive me. And this is just one of the many systemic issues that trans people face, from employment discrimination to homelessness.
Well, and as far as leading into the talk about mentoring and all the rest of that, I just want to point out a lot of people really do still struggle. And a lot of times I think it's gotten better on the whole in society, but there's different cultural divides as far as that goes. It's very personal. I know a lot of young people, and this is something I've had issues with myself. I've got a number of family members with whom I'm still very close, and we get together. My wife stayed with me through transition, and my kids still love me, and I've got a cousin and sister, but I have lost family. And if you're young and you're a young adult and depending on your family for assistance or to move off and gain independence in the world, and you lose those connections, that becomes really challenging. And so for a lot of people, that's one of the things that I've done. And I've noticed with a lot of the young adults specifically, is just, housing issues and getting yourself established and getting yourself on independent feet is, in addition to trying to transition to your proper gender, you're transitioning into adulthood and independence, but it's for some people, it's like a crash course, and, or you've been thrown out of home. What is it in homeless centers? 25% of youth are LGBT kids who've been thrown out of their own homes before age of majority. What the heck is that?
Depending on the level of involvement that you want to have in your mentees' lives, you may need to be prepared to respond to homelessness or complex medical needs or a bad coming out story or even interpersonal violence. Fortunately, Julie did not have to deal with homelessness, but Cass did at times, and her story is really enlightening.
I'm going to be real. I went through a number of hard times myself. I was homeless more than once. I've been in poverty. I've had to use services. I've get medication at times. I've been hungry at times. I'm solid now. I've got, mostly because I'm well married. My wife takes good care of me. But it's not easy, and there's a lot of institutional and real challenges out there, and there still are.
As you can expect, coming out was really hard back in the day, and it still is today, depending on how supportive your family is and where you fall in a specific intersection of race and class.
But there was this thing going around that was kind of common knowledge in the community, and it was called the 50% rule. And this was that only half of us would expect to live past 35 years old. 50% of us. 50% of us would die before we hit 35. And that was one of the things that scared me away. And I thought it was kind of crazy, or that was extreme. So I looked it up afterwards. And that was actually literally a thing that, scientists and, medical experts who were studying this put out. For white people, that's gotten considerably better. For Black people, it still is 35 is the average age. I know Black trans women who have lived past that. Many do live long, rich lives. I don't want to get caught in the stereotype, but many of the deaths are, and the tragic early deaths, especially, and violent deaths, are trans women of color. And so that racism thing is a real issue that persists.
We also can't ignore the slew of new anti-trans legislation being deliberated on right now in the year of our Lord 2021. As I'm recording this episode in late March, there is ongoing legislation in more than 30 states to deny trans people access to equal employment, healthcare, and more, including this past week where Arkansas state legislature passed a bill that prevents all trans youth from seeking gender-affirming healthcare. A thread of these proposed laws is available in the episode's show notes. And even with newfound attention towards trans rights, there are limitations to what can be done within the law. Take employment discrimination, for instance. Thanks to the Supreme Court case around Amy Stevens, rest in power, it is now the law of the land that you cannot fire someone for their gender identity. But
of course, it's still, we get fired for being trans all the time. It's just we get, death by 1,000 cuts is what I call it. Yeah, your coworkers are all 15 minutes late on the regular and they never get noticed. You're 30 seconds late once you're getting written up. Stupid stuff like that happens commonly still in our community.
Trans rights are important, but they're only one part of trans justice, trans liberation. Real trans liberation doesn't just happen in the courts, it happens in your home. It happens in schools, workplaces, and damn it, happens in bathrooms. Why do we have to keep talking about bathrooms? And it'll require a radical shift in how we live our lives, how we do work, how we care for one another, how healthcare is distributed, so on and so forth. Destroy capitalism. It can be pretty disheartening to have your existence debated on, but this just goes to show you how resilient we are. You can legislate all you want, but we are not going away. We are only going to get louder. I don't want to paint the whole trans experience as miserable. I've faced rejection, pain, gatekeeping, and more, but I've also found my true self and a chosen family that will last me a lifetime. And I'm way cuter.
What was initially really empowering for me when I came out as trans was an understanding about myself and my life that I just couldn't get a grasp on beforehand. I was depressed and tried so many different antidepressants, and none of them worked half as well as estrogen did.
Yeah,
because they were always treating symptoms and not the cause. I appreciate how being trans kind of has its own built-in community. That's not to say that you're going to get along with every single person, but there is a number of shared experiences, or at least a commonality amongst us for just certain forms of things that we might have been living through or going through with our own bodies. So there is just a community that all of a sudden comes to light that if you need a space to fit in, these are your people, and they're generally really warm and welcoming.
Finding that family is not always easy, though. Even just finding one mentor who can listen to you can be a challenge depending on where you live.
It depends so much where you're at, what part of the country you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Because somewhere like Minnesota, or now that I'm in the Bay Area, I can be very picky and choosy about who I want in my mentor. Like Minnesota, I had one professor who, they didn't teach any classes in my department, but they were my go-to person for pretty much everything. And they were a part of queer science, and they were my biggest fan and did everything that I could ever ask for in terms of love and support. But in South Carolina, when I'm in a more rural place, it's really about talking to so many of the better feminists in your spaces, and eventually, hopefully, one of them knows a trans person that they can connect you with. Because they're out there. There's somebody out around you who is out there. You may have to travel a little bit further than you'd like to get to those resources. But if you do stay in a lot of the feminist spaces and just start talking about queer things in general and having just queer conversations, somebody's going to mention their trans friend at some point. And hopefully you can get their email address or their number and reach out.
Quick note here, we are about to talk briefly about self-harm and suicide. If you'd like to skip this section, you can go to the time code 47 minutes and 20 seconds. The utter lack of support that comes from this loneliness is what results in the 40% statistic, which is usually used as a transphobic talking point. The numbers vary from 39% to 47% depending on the study, but around 40% of trans people under 18 consider attempting suicide if they don't have any adults in their life who support their transition. To give you an idea of how this is used, I have literally had people respond to my tweets with just 40%, 40% sign. But that's not the whole story, because those same studies show that having just one supportive adult brings that figure all the way down to 16 to 18%, and more support brings it down even more.
If you do know somebody who's trans in your workspace, in your home, or whatever, one of the biggest factors for resiliency, and it's like a 65% difference on suicidality in young trans people, is having just one single supportive adult. Somebody who says, you're valid, you're all right. I know you feel like a hot mess. It doesn't matter. You're still okay. It does get better.
So if you're a cis person who wants to be an ally, A, the next time a transphobe pulls out the 40% stat, you can fire back with the remaining context. And B, if you have a trans kid in your life, all you need to do is be that one supportive adult who listens. Or better yet, connect them to someone else with a trans experience who can give them guidance.
I survived it. You will too. You'll get tougher as time goes on. I know it hurts, and that's okay. And I'll just sit with you while it hurts or whatever you need, But it gives tremendous resiliency. That one, if nothing else you can do, be that one person. That could be life-changing.
I also want to shout out the Trevor Project, which is an incredible, toll-free, 24-hour LGBTQ suicide hotline that you should be aware of. I still remember the first time I realized my story could help people. I was sitting around eating lunch when my best friend texted me that she shared my transition story with two parents who were skeptical about their child possibly pursuing a gender transition. Their child had already come out as gay, which they were fine with, but they were beginning to think that they wanted to transition, which they were not as fine with. They had all these concerns and questions. They didn't understand what that meant, and they were worried their kid would have a miserable life if they did so. But once they heard about my story from my friend, how I transitioned successfully, how happy I am now that I'm living the life I want to live, and how much more smoothly the process would have been if my parents had been supported from the get-go, they were convinced that they should follow their kids' lead and support them however they wanted to change. When my friend told me this, I started crying a lot. Knowing what it was like to transition without support from my parents, I realized that my story may very well have saved this trans kid's life. And I wasn't even the one telling the story. It was such a shift for me, and I found myself thinking, imagine what I could do if I were to stand up proudly and share my story, my wisdom with the world. And this has driven everything that I do now. My mentoring, my outreach, even this podcast. If my story could convince just one otherwise ignorant person to change their perspective, it could have life-saving impacts. And that goes back to another important point for cisgender allies. Be an ally all the time. Here's what I mean. Even if I, Anna Marie, were the perfect trans advocate, there are spaces that I will never enter, whether because I can't as a trans person or don't want to, or because I just don't know about them. Also, being openly and visibly trans, people may change the way they act around me, avoiding transphobic or gender essentialist humor, etc., etc. Moreover, there are some conversations that are dangerous for me to have. While I truly believe that most people are ignorant about trans issues, not actively hateful, there's still that 1 in 100 chance that when I challenge a transphobic joke or talking point, I am talking to an outright bigot, and my safety could be in jeopardy. So I can't be the only soul willing to share my story with ignorant cis people. Sometimes other cis people need to do it themselves.
Because you can be that person who's in that group when they say things that they say when they think no trans people are around. And, this is a vital time to really speak up. And, I don't want to give specific advice. Some people are just blunt and it's like, no, you got to stop that right now. And, some people are, well, have you thought about this? You might do it in a little more direct or indirect. I think that's a personal decision that everyone needs to make depending on their safety, their personality, where they fall in it. But speak up, say something, interrupt with something. I think one of the classic moves, if somebody tells a racist, transphobic, or whatever joke, just kind of look at them blankly and, I don't understand that. Could you explain that?
Allyship is a full-time job, and if you mentor a trans person directly, you better believe that you should be standing up to transphobia around the clock. Another huge way to help your mentee is doing your best to connect us with other queer and trans people in your circles. Or, better yet, actively seek out ways for trans people to find the community that they deserve. This is actually why I wanted to sit down with Julie in the first place, because when she was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, she started a program that does exactly that. An absolute shining example of a mentorship program is Queer Science, which Julie founded at the University of Minnesota, and we're going to talk about that now.
Tell me about Queer Science. What is it? What is it in your own words?
Queer Science is an outreach program that brings in LGBT high school students into university research labs. So we'll have a full day of activities where high school students can come in, talk with us who are scientists doing this work, and try out different majors. So if you're a high school student who is debating, maybe I want to be a chemist or a microbiologist, come in, meet a queer scientist doing that work, and explore your passion for yourself.
I first met Julie at the Out in STEM conference in 2019, and when she told me about this program, I knew it was something that all universities needed to have.
We've had a couple different events over the years. Usually our main events are just one big day once a semester where everyone gets to come in for a 9 to 5 day, have lunch provided, and just try as many different demonstrations and experiments as they'd like. But we've also experimented where we've gone to museums, and we've also gone to like an ecological reserve and gotten to explore what some of the other scientific fields are, especially ones that require field work or just aren't in your traditional lab space.
What stood out to me about this program was how naturally it developed when all the right people came together. As academics doing DEI work, especially after hearing about how hard a marginalized community has it, our instinct is usually to set up a community discussion or healing space. But sometimes marginalized people just want to hang out and be with people who look like them.
Queer Science started sort of by accident. I was the volunteer teen facilitator for a trans support group for teenagers. And the organization, Transforming Families in Minnesota, they are absolutely fantastic. They help parents of trans teens, parents of trans kids in general, will connect and get together and understand what this means for them as parents and try and work through some of their feelings and make sure that they are the best parents that they can be for their trans kids. And so they had a lot of groups where there was just the little kids as well as the teens. And I was a teen facilitator for their spaces. And the teenagers there really didn't want or need a support group. They're teenagers. They just want to hang out and be friends. So they kept on asking me, instead of having 2 hours of a support space, can we go ice skating? Can we go to one of the museums nearby? Can we go see a movie together? So I started organizing all these events for them and just getting us all together to do that. And they really wanted to go and see my science and my research lab. So I tried to find as many other trans scientists as I could on my campus. And the very first Queer Science Day was just 4 of those teenagers, 5 or 6 of my trans friends. We did a bunch of demos together, had lunch. And as soon as the day was over, they were like, that was great. We're going to bring our friends. When's the next time that we're doing this? And I was like, oh, we're continuing this? This is going to go on? Okay, I will see you next semester when I have time to find the money and the planning to make it bigger. And so the next event, we had 12 of them. And we've got 24 usually showing up.
If you build it, they will come.
If you build it, they will come.
We need more positive trans representation and trans-led programs like this across the board, in and outside of college spaces, especially if we're going to fix the leaky pipeline of trans people in STEM.
The two biggest challenges are finding your audience as well as finding the best volunteers for those events, because there's just, when you get to this higher level of education, we've had the leaky pipe for so long, which the leaky pipe refers to how there isn't just one big moment where a bunch of trans academics might be lost out of the system, or any group, but there's a whole bunch of leaks in that pipe where they're slowly trickling out of the system. So finding a bunch of other trans scientists, or even just queer scientists at higher levels, who also have another aspect to their life, because it does become really white rather quickly. And that's not even always the demographic that we're having with our high school students. So we need to make sure that we have somebody who is an Indigenous trans person that is going to be leading the science thing or an environmental thing at this event, or finding, it sort of just becomes token among tokens, where, like, yes, we have the Black trans woman who does research at our university, because there is only one of them. Like, we all just become so tokenized throughout that process of trying to find out what our intersections are.
And this is where allies can come in to help, because having the ability to run science demos, pay your volunteers, and cover the transportation cost of your event attendees requires money. Coin, dinero, the bag, as the kids say. Wow, I'm cringy. Money means grants, donations, sponsors, all those institutional access points that we can't always get by ourselves. Also, worth noting, most of Julie's volunteers worked for free, but they made a point to pay their BIPOC volunteers for the extra labor and representation that they provided.
They were the only people we ended up ever paying to be at our events, because most of us were volunteering as much of work as we could. But if we were really trying to if we knew that some of our student demographics were, like, some of them were applying to be a part of our next event, and we started seeing this community coming in, we really tried to make sure and pay people to be a part of it. And just finding the money and the people and getting everything aligned, that's the hardest part right there.
The best way to help the trans community is to support and empower us to find our own spaces and start our own programs, both emotionally and financially. It's programs like this that have the biggest impact on young trans people, especially in creating long-term support networks that can be there for them for their entire careers.
I really love getting to know some of my students, like, in the long term, and really getting to see them grow and develop, because a lot of our students show up again and again for multiple events, or we've taken a couple of them with us across the country to conferences. And now that they're leaving high school, I get to see where they're getting accepted into college, and, like, what their next plans are, and getting to listen to them as they take those next steps and talk about the impact of our program. I really love being able to hear them come back to us after a really long time and see where they're going with their scientific careers and what they're up to, which colleges did they get accepted into. We've also got a Discord community that's been really tight. So everybody has been, like, chatting in there and staying up to date with each other's plans and making sure that we are actually building a community and not just a one-off event.
By the way, if you're interested in using the queer science model at your university, they've developed just the thing to help you out.
We'd really love to encourage other groups to try similar programs. And if you need any help, we have on our website a zine that you can actually just purchase, and we'll send it to you so you can download. And it has a lot of our tips and tricks on just getting high school students to know about events, to finding funding, and getting engaged.
Institutional access is something that came up a lot in my conversation with Cass as well, since trans representation, and by association, trans power, is still so limited.
One thing I would love to see to develop that I do not know exists right now is specifically to create more networks for mentoring in a business sense. One of the things that straight people have that is a lot more tricky for us to get are connections. And we do not live in a merit society. We live in a society based on connections. It's who knows you, who you can prove yourself to. And that's a lot more challenging for people with marginalized identities, because that's the definition of marginalization. We've been pushed out of the centers of power. So we don't have those connections in power. We're not those people in power. And for those of us who are able to make it and are able to get comfortable and connected, I think it's really important to reach out and be those connections and those business and those formal connections for those who are starting out early.
Cass even gave me a bit of advice that reminded me why I started this episode in the first place.
Well, I just look at it, say, 10 years, 20 years down the line, Anna Marie's this great, successful STEM professor. Everybody loves her because of, your speciality and whatever engineering thing that poor English major me doesn't even understand. Most people don't even think about the fact that you're trans, but you'll be in a position to give letters of recommendation for other people who want to follow in that profession, be it out, they want to get that good engineering job at Pratt and Whitney or submarine base, or, some hopefully peace-based making solar arrays or whatever. We can help each other with that, as well as in academics and other areas. So,
to me, the best thing about being trans is that my family is growing all the time. It has always been my mission to uplift those in my community, and now, having done this episode and spoken to both Cass and Julie about their experiences, I have a much better picture of how I want to give back. Hopefully, if you're a cisgender ally listening to this, you have some ideas too. Or maybe you're intimidated. Maybe you like the idea of starting a program like this, but you don't know any openly trans people, or you don't know how to ask the right questions and you just need a starting point. But let me remind you that sometimes what it takes to be a good mentor to trans people is to just be aware of what we go through and listen to us when we're talking. And little things like having your pronouns in your email signature or your Zoom name actually go a really long way.
I think the biggest thing, there's like the simple 101 things that people should be doing already. Just have your pronouns out there at all times, because it helps other trans people show off and be more comfortable giving out theirs, especially when theirs are not in the binary. Making sure that that's something that is expressly stated on your syllabus, and try to set the tone on the first day of class by saying, hey, these are my pronouns. I want to know your pronouns are as well. That's all kind of the 101 things that I would hope people were already doing, and it's kind of established.
This is the most common advice I give to aspiring trans allies. Most trans people can tell the difference between when you're calling us our name and pronouns because you have to, and when you're calling us our name and pronouns because you see us as the gender that we are. We can tell how comfortable you are, and that factors into how we feel about you as a mentor.
When you go out and you're actually educating yourself and looking up and researching things through trans resources, and you just have a level of awareness, because the professors who are my best allies, there's not anything specific that they're really doing or trying to go out of their way. It's just, you can tell from the way that they're saying it that they're talking about communities, or they're talking about different things. For mostly cisgender heterosexual people, it's the LGBTQ test. That's kind of what I have. And you can see it in politicians all the time. How comfortably can they say the acronym LGBTQ? And you have so many people who, you'll see Elizabeth Warren and she'll just say it quickly and succinctly. Whereas then you see someone like Joe Biden, the LGBTQ community, and they have that slow stutter because they have to think about it. It says a lot about their confidence. Not always, it's not a perfect test, but it's a starting point.
So relax. We don't bite. Just get to know us, learn from us, respect us, and love us. And better yet, establish lasting relationships with us and our organizations. Another two great orgs for STEM fields specifically are OSTEM, short for Out in STEM, which has an annual conference of LGBTQ plus STEM professionals that you can send your mentees to or even recruit new talent from. And Trans Tech, founded by Angelica Ross, which focuses specifically on diverse transgender entrepreneurs and tech professionals. And don't let this episode be the end of your journey. We talked about a lot here, and no offense to Cass or Julie, but both of my guests today were white, and on the more binary side of the trans experience. This conversation will never be complete without stories from trans men and non-binary people from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. I'm fascinated by the ways in which marginalized people can come together and find resilience in one another, so I'm going to be returning to this topic a lot in future episodes. So if you fit this description, just reach out to us. We would love to platform you and any other projects that you have going on. I'm excited to learn more with all of you.
Martin Luther King Jr. said that the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends toward justice. Cassandra Martineau adds to that, ain't nothing bends unless we get out there and bend it.
Hey, thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, subscribe to us on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leave us a review, and share it with a few people. It helps us with the almighty algorithm. If you really like what you heard, consider becoming a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/rule63, where you can get access to bonus content. For each episode we do, Danny and I do a bonus episode where we talk about that month's topic in more detail. And you'll get access to monthly Q&A live streams where you get to engage with us. Also, up on the Patreon right now are the full uncut interviews with Cassandra and Julie. We had such great conversations, and you'll get to hear more about their transition stories, their excellent mentorship experience, and even some cute moments. Here's a preview.
Back when I was a kid, we had to dial phones. You kids got it easy. You don't know how easy you got it.
Also, I just want to add in here, Cass is looking for employment. As this episode hopefully demonstrated, she has lots of experience leading workshops and discussions about LGBTQ issues. If you're an LGBTQ-friendly org in the New England area, shoot us a DM on social media and we can get you connected with her. Also, her and I run a Facebook group called Willimantic Rainbow Connection for any LGBTQ people and allies to come together and network. If you're in the Eastern Connecticut area, consider joining us in that group. We're 200 people strong, and we plan to start having physical meetups in the near future. You can also follow Julie on Twitter at QueerMissFrizzle, amazing name. Especially if you're a queer organizer in the Bay Area in California, hit her up.
Other things, if you're in the Bay Area, just look forward to some version of queer science. Might be called something different, might be some whole new thing, but I definitely want to get back out and doing some kind of volunteer work for the community soon.
If you want to hit us up, all of our socials will be in the show notes and on therule63podcast.com. That's therule63podcast.com. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow us to get notified about our live streams and when new episodes go up every month. Also, last bit of business, but I also appeared on 2 other podcasts this month. Earlier in March, I was on the LGBTQ+ STEMcast, where I laid out my teaching philosophy, abolitionist engineering education, and talked about my transition story. If you want to learn about who I am and what I'm about, go check that out. It's a nice little 35-minute summary. I was also on the latest episode of Cornerstone Conversations. Avid listeners will know that I interviewed the host of that show, Christy Ideong, for our episode on vaccine hesitancy. So go check out that episode and leave her a nice review. Hers is one of my favorite podcasts of all time now. That's all for now. I will see you all next month for another Rule 63 episode. Bye!